Before we begin, you need to understand something. Vodka isn't just a drink, it's a tragedy. This is not a story about parties, about toasts in dimly lit bars, about James Bond's martinis shaken, not stirred. This is not about college nights or wedding receptions or the clinker shot glasses in celebration. This is the story of how a clear, burning liquid became the fuel of empires, the weapon of tyrants, and the curse that has haunted Eastern Europe for 5 centuries. It is a story of power and control, of addiction weaponized as state policy, of millions of lives consumed not by choice but by design. Vodka has drowned nations. It has funded wars and toppled governments. It has been both the lifeblood of imperial treasuries and the poison that hollowed out entire generations. It is celebrated in luxury bars from New York to Tokyo, marketed as sophistication and elegance. Yet in the lands of its birth, it remains what it has always been, a destroyer of men, a tool of oppression, a tragedy measured in unmarked graves and shattered families. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. If you're finding value in this journey through history, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It helps more than you know, and it connects us across the distances. Now, phone away, distractions silenced, settle in. What you're about to hear will take us from the frozen steppes of medieval Russia to the glittering palaces of Catherine the Great, from the trenches of World War I to the collapsed Soviet state where desperation turned to bottles of antifreeze and industrial solvent. We will meet tsars and revolutionaries, intellectuals and oligarchs. We will walk through centuries of deliberate, calculated destruction. And we will confront a question that has no easy answer. How did a simple distilled grain spirit become the foundation of empires built on the corpses of their own people? This will be dark. This will be complex. This will not resolve neatly. But it is a story that must be told. So let us begin. To understand vodka, we must travel back to a time before Russia even existed, to the dark forests and frozen rivers of medieval Eastern Europe. But first, we must go even further back, to the deserts of Persia, to the laboratories of Arab alchemists, to the moment when humans first learned to capture fire in liquid form. Distillation is ancient. The technique, heating fermented liquid to separate alcohol from water through evaporation and condensation, was perfected by Persian scholars in the 8th and 9th centuries of the Common Era. They were not seeking intoxication. They were seeking medicine, perfume, the essence of plants captured in concentrated form. The apparatus they used, the alembic, was a marvel of medieval engineering. Copper vessels, coiled tubes, the careful application of heat. Through this process, they created aqua vitae, the water of life. By the 10th and 11th centuries, Arab alchemists had refined the technology to extraordinary levels. Their knowledge traveled along trade routes, carried by merchants and scholars, moving slowly westward into Europe. The Moors brought it to Spain. The Crusaders encountered it in the Levant. Medical schools in Italy and France began to experiment with distillation, producing spirits for medicinal purposes, to treat plague, to disinfect wounds, to dull pain. This was aqua vitae, water of life, a medicine, a solvent, a miracle substance that seemed to capture the very essence of vitality in liquid form. But there was a problem in the cold north. In the regions where winter stretched for half the year and temperatures plunged far below freezing, the distillation process was crude, inefficient. The spirits produced were harsh, impure, contaminated with toxic compounds. They burned the throat and clouded the mind in unpleasant ways. Then came a crucial discovery. In the lands where the cold was not an obstacle but a tool, distillers learned to harness winter itself, freeze distillation. By exposing barrels of low-proof alcohol to the brutal cold of a northern winter, water would freeze, while the alcohol with its lower freezing point remained liquid. The ice could be removed, and what remained was purer, stronger, more refined. This technique, born of necessity in the frozen expanses of Eastern Europe, would become foundational to vodka's development. By the 12th and 13th centuries, knowledge of distillation had reached the principalities that would one day become Russia. The technology arrived through the Baltic trade routes, through German merchants and Polish clergy, through the slow diffusion of knowledge across a medieval world increasingly connected by commerce and conquest. But distilled spirits were still rare, still medicinal, still the domain of monasteries and apothecaries. The real transformation came with the grain.
Surplus problem. In agricultural societies dependent on wheat, rye, and barley, there was always the question of preservation. Grain stored too long would rot. Grain harvests varied wildly year to year. In years of abundance, what could be done with the excess? The answer for many Northern European communities was fermentation and distillation. Grain could be transformed into alcohol, which did not spoil. It could be stored indefinitely. It could be traded, used as medicine, or consumed in small quantities during the endless dark months of winter. It was practical, it was efficient, it was survival. This was not vodka, not yet. These were crude grain spirits, often called bread wine, chlebnoye vino, in the Slavic languages. They were harsh, unrefined, and consumed cautiously, if at all. But the technology was in place, the economic logic was in place, the cultural conditions were aligning. In the principalities of Muscovy, in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, in the scattered settlements clinging to survival in the vast forests and frozen plains of Eastern Europe, the knowledge of distillation was taking root. Monasteries experimented with different grains, rye, wheat, barley. They refined their techniques. They improved the taste, the clarity, the potency. The water of life had arrived in the land where it would become something else entirely. But when this technology reached the frozen expanses of Muscovy, something changed. The water of life became something else entirely. The year was 1386. Genoese merchants arrived in Moscow bearing gifts for Grand Prince Dmitry Donskoy. Among the silks and spices and exotic goods from distant lands, they brought bottles of aqua vitae, the concentrated grape spirits of Italy. The Russian court received them with curiosity and caution. They tasted the liquid. It burned. It was too strong, too harsh, too foreign. The nobles recoiled. This was not wine, not mead, not the familiar fermented drinks of the Russian table. This was something aggressive, something unnatural. Some whispered that it was demonic, a poison from the West. The aqua vitae was largely rejected, but the idea remained. In the decades that followed, knowledge of distillation spread through the monasteries of Muscovy. Russian Orthodox monks, those learned men who preserved literacy and technical knowledge through the medieval centuries, began to experiment. They had no grapes, the climate was too harsh, the winters too brutal, but they had grain. Rye and wheat, barley and oats, the very foundation of survival in the northern forests. The monks adopted the foreign technology to Russian materials. They fermented grain into a weak beer, then distilled it, once, twice, 3 times, each distillation removing impurities, increasing potency, clarifying the liquid. They used the freeze distillation technique, leaving barrels outside in the savage cold of January, removing the ice, concentrating the alcohol. By the middle of the 15th century, during the reign of Ivan III, the first truly Russian distilled spirits emerged. They called it chlebnoye vino, bread wine, sometimes zhiznenie voda, the Slavic rendering of aqua vitae, the water of life. It was made from rye primarily, the grain that grew most reliably in Russian soil. It was clearer than the Italian spirits, less aromatic, more neutral in flavor. This was the ancestor of vodka, but it was not yet vodka. The word itself, vodka, a diminutive of wada, water, would not become common for another century or more. Little water, dear water, a term of endearment perhaps, or a euphemism for something more dangerous than it appeared. In these early years, Russian distilled spirits remained rare and controlled. Production was limited to monasteries and a handful of authorized distilleries under state supervision. Consumption was largely confined to the nobility, the clergy, and the wealthy Russian class. It was expensive, it was exotic. It was still primarily understood as medicinal, a remedy for cold, for pain, for the countless ailments that plagued a harsh and unforgiving land. The peasants, the vast majority of the population, drank kvass and weak beer. They fermented honey into mead. They knew of the stronger spirits, but they were beyond reach, beyond necessity. Life was hard enough. Survival consumed all effort. Intoxication was a luxury, not a need. But the infrastructure was forming, the knowledge was spreading, the economic potential was becoming visible to those who controlled the levers of power. Grain transformed into alcohol represented value, portable, storable, taxable value. It represented revenue for a state constantly hungry for resources to fund wars, to build fortifications, to expand territory. The Russian state was beginning to understand what it had stumbled upon, not just a drink, not just a medicine, but a tool, a means of control, a source of wealth that could flow directly into the treasury, bypassing the complexities of agriculture.
Taxation. The water of life had taken root in Russian soil. It was still innocent, still contained, but the seeds of catastrophe were already germinating in the frozen ground. Then came Ivan the Terrible, and with him the first glimpse of vodka's true power over men and nations. Ivan IV, who would earn his epithet through decades of paranoia, brutality, and breathtaking violence, ascended to the title of Tsar of all Russia in 1547. He was 16 years old. He would rule for 37 years, transforming Muscovy from a regional power into an empire. And in the process, he would forge one of history's most sinister partnerships between state power and mass intoxication. The innovation came in the 1550s. Between 1552 and 1557, Ivan established the first kabaks, state-run taverns with an exclusive monopoly on the sale of distilled spirits. This was not merely a business venture. It was social engineering on a grand scale. Before the kabaks, alcohol production and sale had been loosely regulated, scattered among monasteries, noble estates, and small private operators. Peasants could brew their own beer and mead for personal consumption or local sale. The market was diffuse, impossible to fully control, difficult to tax efficiently. Ivan changed everything. The kabak system worked with brutal simplicity. The Tsar declared all private production of distilled spirits illegal. Vodka, or klibnoye vino as it was still commonly called, could only be sold in state-authorized taverns. These kabaks were franchised out to operators who paid hefty fees to the crown for the privilege. The operators in turn were given license to maximize profit by any means necessary, and they did. The kabaks were designed for one purpose: to extract as much money as possible from the Russian people through alcohol consumption. Unlike traditional taverns or inns, the kabaks sold only vodka. No food was allowed. No beer, no wine, no mead, only the hard spirits that delivered intoxication quickly and completely. The goal was not hospitality, it was not social gathering, it was pure, efficient inebriation. The prices were kept low enough to be accessible to peasants and workers, but high enough to generate enormous profit. The vodka itself was often of poor quality, inadequately distilled, contaminated with impurities. It didn't matter, people drank it anyway. More insidiously, the kabaks operated on a system of debt and credit. A peasant could drink beyond his means, running up a tab that would be collected later, with interest. Entire families became trapped in cycles of vodka debt, owing money to the kabak operators, who in turn owed revenue to the state. The system was designed to create dependency, both chemical and financial. Within a generation, the kabak system had metastasized across Muscovy. Every town, every village of sufficient size had its state tavern. The revenue flowing into the royal treasury was staggering. By the late 16th century, vodka sales accounted for somewhere between 30 and 40% of state income. The Russian government had become addicted to alcohol revenue. It needed the people to drink. It needed them to drink constantly, destructively, without limit. This was the birth of state-sponsored alcoholism. Ivan understood instinctively what later tyrants would learn through experience. A drunk population is a compliant population. Peasants numbed by vodka were less likely to rebel, less capable of organizing resistance, less aware of their exploitation. The kabak served the same function as the Roman circus, bread in circuses, except the bread was liquid and the circus was the slow dissolution of human dignity. Reports from the era describe scenes of staggering despair, men drinking away their wages on the day they were paid, wives pleading outside kabaks for their husbands to come home, children going hungry while their fathers consumed the family's survival in a state-run tavern, violence and disorder spreading through communities as alcohol consumption soared. The Russian Orthodox Church protested. Priests preached against the kabaks, warning that they were destroying the moral fabric of society, tearing apart families, creating hell on earth. Some monasteries that had once produced spirits for medicinal purposes now refused to distill at all, horrified by what their innovation had become. Ivan ignored them. The state needed the money. Wars against the Tatars, against Poland, Lithuania, against Sweden, these campaigns consumed vast resources. The expansion of Muscovy into Siberia required funding. The construction of fortifications, the maintenance of the Streltsy military corps, the extravagance of the royal court, all of it demanded revenue, and vodka provided. In 1565, Ivan created the Oprachina, this personal security force and reign of terror. These black-clad horsemen ravaged the Russian countryside, executing suspected traitors, confiscating property, terrorizing the nobility and peasantry.
Alike, the Oprachnina sustained itself partly through the kabak revenues. The people's drunkenness funded their own oppression. The cruelty of the system was in its efficiency. The state controlled production, controlled distribution, and profited from every drop consumed. It created the conditions that drove people to drink: grinding poverty, hopelessness, brutal labor conditions, arbitrary violence, and then profited from their attempts to escape those conditions through intoxication. By the time Ivan IV died in 1584, he left behind a legacy of territorial expansion and centralized power, but he also left behind a Russia fundamentally transformed in its relationship to alcohol. What had once been a rare medicinal substance or elite luxury was now woven into the fabric of daily life for millions. The kabak was as much a feature of Russian villages as the church, as the landlord's estate, as the frozen fields where peasants labored. The infrastructure of state addiction was complete. Production, distribution, consumption, all controlled by the crown, all designed to maximize revenue regardless of human cost. The bottle and the throne had become inseparable. This was not an accident. This was not the unintended consequence of well-meaning policy. This was deliberate. This was Ivan the Terrible's genius, if such a word can be applied to something so monstrous. He understood that a nation's weakness could be its government's strength, that the suffering of the many could fund the ambitions of the few, that vodka properly controlled was not just a drink but a weapon. And once that weapon was forged, it would be wielded by every Russian ruler who followed. For the next 2 centuries, vodka sank its teeth deeper into the Russian soul, and then came a German princess who would change everything. She was born Sophie Friederike Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornberg in the Prussian city of Stettin. She arrived in Russia in 1744 as a teenager, brought to marry the heir to the Russian throne. She converted to Russian Orthodoxy, took the name Catherine, and married the incompetent, possibly mad Grand Duke Peter. 18 years later, in 1762, she orchestrated a coup d'état, deposed her husband, and seized the throne as Catherine II, Catherine the Great. She would rule Russia for 34 years, from 1762 until her death in 1796, and she would preside over a golden age of Russian power, territorial expansion, and cultural flowering. She corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot. She patronized the arts and sciences. She spoke the language of the Enlightenment, reason, progress, human dignity, the rights of man. And she expanded the vodka monopoly to unprecedented levels. The contradiction was absolute. Catherine presented herself as an enlightened monarch, bringing Western rationality and human governance to the backward Russian Empire. She wrote treatises on law and justice. She founded schools and hospitals. She collected paintings and built palaces that rivaled Versailles. Yet the economic foundation of her reign, the revenue stream that funded her ambitions, was the systematic alcoholism of her subjects. In 1765, Catherine issued a decree that would transform Russian vodka production forever. She granted the nobility exclusive rights to distill spirits on their estates. Private production, which had been illegal since Ivan's time, was now permitted, but only for the aristocratic class. Peasants and commoners remained forbidden from distilling. They could only purchase vodka from noble-owned operations or state kabaks. The result was an explosion of production. Noble estates across Russia established distilleries. Landlords discovered that vodka was more profitable than grain, more reliable than timber, easier to transport than livestock. A serf who harvested rye could see that same rye transformed into vodka and sold back to him at enormous markup. The aristocracy became a distilling class, their wealth increasingly dependent on alcohol sales. Quality improved. With competition among noble distillers, techniques advanced. Multiple distillations became standard, producing clearer, purer spirits. Charcoal filtration removed impurities. Some distillers experimented with flavorings, honey, fruit, herbs, though the trend was increasingly toward the neutral, flavorless clarity that would become vodka's defining characteristic. Export began. Russian vodka reached Poland, Sweden, Prussia. Foreign markets opened. What had once been a domestic curse became an international commodity. Russian identity became intertwined with vodka, the drink that could withstand the brutal cold, the spirit that matched the Russian character, fierce and uncompromising. But domestically, catastrophe was unfolding. Alcohol consumption soared to epidemic levels. With production decentralized and noble distillers competing for market share, vodka became cheaper and more available than ever before. Peasants who had once consumed alcohol occasionally now tried
habitually. Alcoholism, previously confined to certain populations and regions, became universal. The debt cycles intensified. Peasants bought vodka on credit from the same nobles who owned their labor, their land, their lives. The bottle became another chain binding serfs to their masters. A peasant who owed vodka debts could be prevented from leaving the estate, from marrying, from any semblance of autonomy. medical and social consequences mounted. Life expectancy in heavy drinking regions began to diverge noticeably from areas with less alcohol saturation. Infant mortality rates climbed as pregnant women consumed spirits. Domestic violence became endemic. Village priests reported that alcohol was destroying communities faster than famine or plague ever had. And then came rebellion. Between 1773 and 1775, a Don Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev led the largest peasant uprising in Russian history. The Pugachev rebellion engulfed vast territories, threatening Catherine's hold on power. The causes were many: serfdom's brutality, military conscription, economic exploitation. But among the grievances voiced by the rebels was rage over vodka debts, over the kabak system, over the way alcohol had become a tool of oppression. Catherine crushed the rebellion with extraordinary violence. Pugachev was captured, executed, and dismembered in Moscow's Red Square in January 1775. Thousands of rebels were hanged, tortured, sent to Siberian exile. The message was clear: resistance was futile. After the rebellion, Catherine faced a choice. She understood the connection between alcohol saturation and social unrest. Her advisors presented evidence of the damage vodka was inflicting. Proposals for reform circulated: restrictions on production, limit on kabak hours, prohibition of sales on credit. She considered them, and then she rejected them. The treasury needed the money. The wars against the Ottoman Empire, the partitions of Poland, the expansion into Crimea and the northern shores of the Black Sea, these triumphs of Catherine's reign required staggering resources. By the late 18th century, vodka revenues accounted for 25 to 30% of the state budget. To curtail vodka sales would be to cripple the state financially. Catherine chose empire over the welfare of her people. She chose palaces and armies and territorial glory over the lives of millions drowning in alcohol. The Enlightenment, it turned out, had its limits. Reason and progress and human dignity were beautiful ideals, but they were negotiable when weighed against revenue and power. The contradiction would define Russia for the next 2 centuries. Vodka funded Russian greatness, and vodka destroyed the Russian people. Both things were true. Both things were deliberate. Both things were the choice of rulers who understood exactly what they were doing. As the 19th century dawned, vodka's grip tightened, and then came the voices of resistance: doctors, writers, priests, who saw what was happening and cried out. By the middle of the 1800s, the catastrophe was undeniable. Russia's greatest minds began to confront the vodka crisis with a moral clarity that the state had always lacked. These were not temperance scolds or religious fanatics. These were the literary titans of the age, men who had witnessed firsthand what alcohol was doing to the Russian soul. Fyodor Dostoevsky knew the darkness intimately. In 1839, when he was 17 years old, his father, a retired military doctor who had become a brutal and tyrannical landowner, was murdered by his own serfs. The official story was that Mikhail Dostoevsky died of apoplexy, a stroke. But the truth, whispered and known, was that the serfs had held him down and poured vodka down his throat until he drowned in it. They had murdered him with the very substance that had driven them to desperation. This trauma haunted Dostoevsky for the rest of his life. In his novels, Crime and Punishment, The Brothers Karamazov, The Idiot, alcohol appears again and again as a destroyer, a corrupter, a demon that hollows out human beings from within. His characters drink to forget, drink to endure, drink until they become shadows of themselves. Dostoevsky understood that vodka was not just a vice, it was a structural feature of Russian misery, inseparable from poverty, oppression, and despair. But it was Leo Tolstoy who became vodka's most formidable enemy. Tolstoy, by the 1880s and 1890s, had undergone a radical spiritual transformation. The author of War and Peace and Anna Karenina had rejected his earlier life of aristocratic privilege and embraced a form of Christian anarchism. He renounced violence, property, the state itself, and he became a passionate advocate for temperance. In 1891, Tolstoy published an essay titled The First Step. In it, he argued that abstinence from alcohol was the essential first step toward moral and spiritual enlightenment. He condemned vodka as a poison that enslaved the Russian people,
that made them complicit in their own oppression. He founded temperance societies, spoke at gatherings, corresponded with activists across Russia and Europe. The Tsarist state was not pleased. Tolstoy's temperance work was seen as seditious, a threat to state revenue and social order. Police monitored his activities. His writings on alcohol were censored. But Tolstoy was too famous, too internationally celebrated to be silenced completely. He continued his campaign until his death in 1910. And he was not alone. Between 1858 and 1859, a remarkable wave of temperance riots swept across rural Russia. peasants in village after village, coordinating through networks that historians still don't fully understand, organized mass refusals to purchase vodka. They smashed kabaks, drove out alcohol merchants, took solemn vows of abstinence. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the people themselves might break the cycle. The government responded with military force. Soldiers were sent to restore order, to protect the kabaks, to ensure the flow of vodka resumed. Hundreds of peasants were arrested, flogged, exiled to Siberia. The temperance movement was crushed. Medical evidence mounted throughout the era. Russian physicians published studies documenting the correlation between alcohol consumption and mortality. In regions with high vodka saturation, life expectancy was as much as 10 years lower than in areas with less drinking. Infant mortality soared. Tuberculosis rates climbed. Doctors began to speak of alcoholism as a national disease, an epidemic that was killing Russia more effectively than any foreign invader. The Russian Orthodox Church, which had protested since Ivan's time, intensified its campaign. Priests delivered sermons against drunkenness. Some parishes organized their own temperance societies, offering support and community to those trying to quit. Monasteries that had once distilled vodka now refused to touch the substance, calling it sinful, an abomination. Tsar Alexander II, who ruled from 1855 to 1881 and is remembered for emancipating the serfs in 1861, considered reform. He commissioned studies, he met with temperance advocates. Proposals reached his desk: restrictions on production, limits on sales hours, bans on credit purchases, increased penalties for public drunkenness. And then he rejected them, all of them. The state treasury by the 1860s and 1870s was dependent on vodka revenue to fund military modernization, infrastructure development, and the machinery of empire. To meaningfully reduce alcohol consumption would be to bankrupt the government. Alexander understood this. Every Tsar after him would understand it too. Russia knew what vodka was doing. The evidence was overwhelming. The voices crying out were the greatest minds the nation had produced. But knowing and acting are different things. The state had made its choice long ago. It had chosen revenue over human life. It had chosen short-term gain over long-term survival. It had built an empire on the corpses of alcoholics, and it could not afford to stop. The 19th century closed with vodka flowing more freely than ever. Then came war. And vodka, as always, followed the soldiers. But this time, something unprecedented happened. This time, Russia tried to quit. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Within days, the great powers of Europe were mobilizing. Russia, bound by treaty to Serbia and driven by Slavic solidarity and imperial ambition, began calling up its reserves. Millions of men received orders to report for military service, and Tsar Nicholas II made a decision that would shock the empire and alter the course of history. On August 22, 1914, the Russian government announced a prohibition on the sale of vodka for the duration of the war. It was called the Dry Law, and it was one of the most radical alcohol bans in history. The initial justification was military necessity. A sober army was a disciplined army. Soldiers reporting for duty drunk were useless, disruptive, dangerous to themselves and their comrades. The mobilization period had been chaotic, with drunken scenes at railway stations as conscripts said goodbye to their families with bottles in hand. Nicholas and his advisors concluded that winning the war required sobriety. But there was also a moral dimension. Some in the government genuinely believed this was an opportunity for national renewal, a chance to break the vodka curse that had plagued Russia for centuries. Patriotic sacrifice would include sacrificing the bottle. Russia would enter the modern era sober, disciplined, reborn. The prohibition began modestly. In August 1914, it applied only to areas under military jurisdiction and during mobilization. But within months, it expanded. By 1915, it covered most of the empire. And by 1916, it was total. No vodka sales anywhere in Russia, to anyone, for any reason. The kabaks were closed. The distilleries were shuttered or converted to
industrial alcohol production for the war effort. The centuries-old vodka monopoly simply stopped. The immediate effects were stunning. Public drunkenness vanished almost overnight. Police records from Moscow and St. Petersburg show that arrests for alcohol-related offenses dropped by 50% within the first year. Crime rates overall declined. Domestic violence incidents decreased. Hospitals reported fewer alcohol poisonings, fewer cirrhosis cases, fewer admissions for delirium tremens. Workers showed up to their jobs sober. Factory productivity increased. Coal mines and steel mills reported improvements in output and safety. The war industries, desperate for every advantage, benefited from a workforce that was no longer losing days to hangovers and benders. Savings rates rose. With money not being poured into vodka, working-class families began to accumulate small amounts of capital. Some paid off debts. Some purchased better food, better clothing. The economic behavior of millions shifted almost immediately. Health indicators improved. Life expectancy projections began to tick upward. Infant mortality rates stabilized and in some regions declined. Doctors observed improvements in general public health that they attributed directly to the absence of alcohol. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. Russia was sobering up. The dream that Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and the temperance priest had championed was becoming reality. But there was a problem, a catastrophic problem. The Russian state had just eliminated 30% of its revenue overnight. Vodka sales had provided somewhere between 700 million and 1 billion rubles annually to the imperial treasury. That money funded the military, the bureaucracy, the infrastructure of governance, and now it was gone, simply gone. The timing could not have been worse. World War I was consuming resources at a rate that no one had anticipated. Modern industrial warfare, machine guns, artillery barrages, trench systems, railways, logistics required staggering amounts of money. Russia was mobilizing millions of soldiers, equipping them, feeding them, moving them across vast distances. The cost was astronomical. To compensate for the lost vodka revenue, the government began printing money, lots of money. Rubles flooded the economy without corresponding increases in goods or productivity. The inevitable result was inflation, then hyperinflation. Prices for basic goods began to rise. Bread, coal, fabric, everything became more expensive. Workers' wages, which had seemed more valuable without vodka draining them, were eroded by the collapsing currency. By 1916, the Russian economy was in free fall. The war was going badly. Casualties were horrific, millions dead, millions more wounded or captured. Supply lines were breaking down. The railways couldn't handle the demands of both military transport and civilian needs. Food shortages appeared in cities. Fuel shortages followed. The winter of 1916-1917 was brutal, and the state lacked the resources to alleviate the suffering. And the people were angry. Because while the dry law had eliminated legal vodka, it had not eliminated the desire for alcohol, or the supply. A massive black market emerged almost immediately. Samagon, home-distilled moonshine, flooded the empire. Peasants who had always made small amounts of alcohol for personal use now ramped up production. Those with the skills and equipment became underground distillers, producing vodka in hidden stills, selling it at enormous markup, taking risks for profit. The quality ranged from poor to lethal. Without proper distillation techniques or equipment, Samagon often contained dangerous levels of methanol and other toxic compounds. Poisonings became common. People died from drinking industrial alcohol, cologne, medical spirits, anything with ethanol content. Desperate drinkers consumed substances that would have been unthinkable before Prohibition. Sugar disappeared from stores. It was being diverted to illegal alcohol production. Bread shortages were partly attributed to grain being secretly distilled rather than baked. The black market in alcohol became intertwined with other forms of underground commerce, creating networks of organized crime that would outlast the empire itself. The government's attempt to enforce prohibition was half-hearted and ineffective. Local police were overwhelmed, underfunded, often corrupted by bribes from illegal distillers. In rural areas, enforcement was virtually non-existent. Even in cities, Samagon was readily available to those who knew where to look. The dry law had become another grievance in a growing list. Workers who had initially benefited from sobriety now faced unemployment, breadlines, and freezing homes. Soldiers at the front were dying in pointless offenses while their families starved at home, and the traditional escape, the solace of vodka, was denied to them, officially at least. The prohibition didn't cause the
Russian Revolution, but it contributed to the state's fiscal collapse, to the public anger, to the sense that the government was incompetent and out of touch. The dry law was intended to strengthen Russia for war. Instead, it weakened the state's financial foundation at the precise moment when that foundation needed to be strongest. By early 1917, everything was unraveling. In February, bread riots in Petrograd escalated into revolution. The Tsar's troops refused to fire on the crowds. Nicholas II abdicated on March 15, 1917. The 300-year-old Romanov dynasty collapsed. The dry law, that noble experiment in forced sobriety, had lasted less than 3 years.
It had improved lives and destroyed the treasury. It had proven that Russia could survive without vodka revenue and simultaneously demonstrated that the Russian state could not. The irony was absolute. Sobriety had made the people healthier, wealthier, more capable, and it had bankrupted the government that oppressed them, accelerating its downfall. When the Romanovs fell, the Bolsheviks inherited a sober, angry nation. They promised many things, but vodka would return. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin seized power in the October Revolution of 1917, leading the Bolshevik Party in a coup that overthrew the provisional government and plunged Russia into civil war. The Bolsheviks promised a workers' paradise, the end of exploitation, the creation of a new socialist man, unburdened by the vices and oppressions of capitalism. Vodka, they declared, was one of those vices. Lenin was ideologically opposed to alcohol. He had written extensively about how vodka served as the opiate of the masses, a deliberate misquotation of Marx, but an accurate description of Russian reality. Alcohol, Lenin argued, dulled revolutionary consciousness. It made workers compliant, passive, unable to recognize their class interests. The Tsarist regime had kept the people drunk to keep them enslaved. The new Soviet state would be different. The dry law remained in effect. Lenin maintained the prohibition through the Civil War years, from 1917 to 1921 and beyond. There were practical reasons. Grain was desperately scarce, needed for bread, not spirits. But there was also revolutionary principle. The new Soviet man would not need vodka. He would find meaning in labor, in collective purpose, in building socialism. The problem was that the new Soviet state was broke. The Civil War had devastated what remained of the Russian economy. Millions had died in combat from disease, from famine. Infrastructure was destroyed. Industrial production had collapsed to a fraction of pre-war levels. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918 had surrendered vast territories to Germany. Foreign powers, Britain, France, Japan, the United States, had intervened militarily, supporting the white forces against the Reds. When the Bolsheviks finally won in 1921, they inherited ruins. The treasury was empty, the currency was worthless, the state apparatus barely functioned. Lenin introduced the new economic policy, a partial retreat from pure socialism, allowing some private enterprise and market mechanisms. It was a pragmatic compromise, designed to rebuild the economy before resuming the march towards communism. But the revenue problem remained. The Soviet state needed money, desperately. And everyone knew where the money was, where it had always been. Lenin resisted, even as the economic crisis deepened, even as advisors pointed to the Tsarist precedent. Lenin held firm. Vodka would not return, not while he lived. He died on January 21, 1924, after a series of strokes. He was 53 years old. The leadership struggle that followed would determine the fate of the Soviet Union and the fate of vodka. Joseph Stalin, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, began his consolidation of power. He was Georgian by birth, a former seminary student turned revolutionary, a man of profound brutality and cunning. And in 1925, Stalin made a decision that Lenin had refused to make. He legalized vodka. The official justification was economic necessity. The Soviet Union needed revenue to industrialize, to build socialism, to defend itself against hostile capitalist powers. Vodka production would be a temporary measure, a tactical retreat, a pragmatic solution to an urgent problem. Once the economy stabilized, once socialism was fully constructed, vodka could be phased out. It was a lie. Stalin knew it was a lie. In a private meeting, accounts vary on the exact date and attendees, but the quote is well documented. Stalin reportedly said, "We need the money. Vodka will bring us more than capitalism ever could." He was right. The state vodka monopoly was restored in 1925. Distilleries reopened. The kabaks, now called Soviet trade establishments, resumed sales. And the revenue poured in. Within a few years, alcohol sales accounted for between 20 and 25% of state revenue. By the 1930s, during the peak of industrialization, that figure would climb to nearly 40%. This was the Faustian bargain at the heart of the Soviet project. Stalin would build socialism, factories, dams, collective farms, a modern military, on the backs of alcoholics. The 5-year plans, those ambitious programs to transform the Soviet Union from a backward agrarian society into an industrial superpower, were funded substantially by vodka sales. The first 5-year plan launched in 1928. Its goals were staggering. Double steel production, triple coal output, electrify the countryside, collectivize agriculture, eliminate illiteracy. The human cost was immense. Millions of peasants were forced onto collective farms. Those who resisted, the kulaks, the so-called wealthy peasants, were executed, starved, or sent to labor camps in Siberia. The famine of 1932-1933 killed somewhere between 6 and 8 million people, primarily in Ukraine. And through it all, vodka flowed. Workers in the new factories drank to forget the brutal conditions, 12-hour shifts, dangerous machinery, inadequate housing, constant surveillance. Peasants on collective farms drank to endure the theft of their land, their grain, their autonomy. Gulag prisoners, when they could get it, drank to numb themselves to the horror of forced labor in the Arctic cold. And the state encouraged it. Vodka was sold in factory canteens, in rural stores, at state-run restaurants. It was cheap, ubiquitous, and profitable. The Soviet government had become as addicted to vodka revenue as the Tsarist regime had been. The opiate of the masses was now funding the dictatorship of the proletariat. The propaganda was grotesque. Soviet media celebrated vodka as part of Russian cultural heritage, a symbol of strength and endurance. Posters depicted workers sharing drinks after productive labor. The state promoted moderate consumption as acceptable, even patriotic. What they hid were the statistics, the alcoholism rates, the mortality figures, the social devastation. By the 1960s, alcohol consumption in the Soviet Union had reached historic highs. Per capita consumption of pure alcohol was over 15 liters annually, among the highest in the world. Male life expectancy began to stagnate, then decline. In a developed, industrialized nation, this was unprecedented. Life expectancy is supposed to rise. In the Soviet Union, it was falling. The reasons were complex: poor healthcare, dangerous working conditions, environmental pollution, diet, smoking, but alcohol was the primary factor. Vodka was killing Soviet men in their 40s and 50s before they reached old age. Heart disease, liver failure, accidents, violence, suicide. Alcohol contributed to all of it. Women suffered differently, but no less profoundly. Domestic violence, enabled and intensified by alcohol, was epidemic. Fetal alcohol syndrome rates climbed. Children grew up in households where drunkenness was normal, where paychecks disappeared into bottles, where hope was measured in the space between drinks. The state knew. Medical researchers published studies, sociologists documented the crisis, internal party reports acknowledged the problem, but nothing changed. The state could not afford to change. The budgets were built on vodka revenue. The 5-year plans, the military expansion, the space program, the competition with the West, all of it required money, and vodka provided. This was the dark heart of Soviet socialism. The workers' paradise was constructed on the systematic destruction of workers. The state that claimed to liberate humanity from capitalist exploitation had monetized addiction more efficiently than any capitalist ever could. The revolution that promised to free the masses had enslaved them to a bottle manufactured, distributed, and profited from by the revolutionary state itself. Lenin had understood the danger. He had kept vodka banned on principle, even at tremendous cost. But Lenin died, and Stalin, pragmatic and ruthless, made the choice that every Russian ruler since Ivan the Terrible had made. He chose revenue. He chose power. He chose the short-term gain of vodka profits over the long-term survival of the people he claimed to serve. The Soviet Union would last another 66 years after Stalin's death in 1953. But the vodka state he created would outlast him, outlast his successors, and ultimately contribute to the empire's collapse. While the Soviet Union drowned its people in state vodka, the West was discovering a very different version of the drink. The story begins with a refugee. Vladimir Smirnov, heir to a vodka empire that had supplied the Russian imperial court, fled the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. His family's distillery was nationalized, his wealth confiscated, his world destroyed. He escaped through Constantinople, eventually settling in France, where he attempted to rebuild the Smirnov brand in exile. It didn't work. Europe in the 1920s and 30s had little appetite for Russian vodka.
Spirits. Smirnov struggled financially, and in 1933 he sold the American rights to his name, slightly anglicized to Smirnov, to an American businessman named Rudolf Kunet for virtually nothing. Kunet's venture also failed. Americans during the Great Depression weren't buying expensive foreign liquor. By 1939, the Smirnov brand was bankrupt, producing barely 1,000 cases per year. That's when a company called Hebuline purchased it for $14,000, roughly the price of a modest house. What happened next was marketing genius. Hebuline understood something fundamental. Vodka's weakness was also its strength. It had no distinctive flavor, no regional terroir, no cultural associations in America. It was a blank canvas. And in the hands of Madison Avenue advertisers in the post-war boom, that blankness became aspirational. The first major campaign, launched in the late 1940s and early 1950s, marketed vodka as white whiskey. The tagline emphasized that vodka would leave you breathless, meaning no telltale alcohol smell on your breath. This appealed to business executives, to housewives, to anyone who wanted to drink discreetly. Vodka became the respectable liquor, the modern choice, the spirit of sophistication without consequence. Then came the cocktails. The Moscow Mule, invented around 1941, vodka, ginger beer, and lime juice served in a distinctive copper mug, became a sensation. It was exotic but accessible, foreign but friendly. The copper mug was brilliant branding, making the drink instantly recognizable. Bars across America began stocking vodka just to serve Moscow Mules. The Bloody Mary followed. Vodka, tomato juice, spices, a drink that could be consumed at brunch without judgment, marketed as a hangover cure, a meal and medicine in a glass. Vodka was being domesticated, transformed from harsh Russian peasant fuel into versatile American mixology. But the real breakthrough came from fiction. In 1953, Ian Fleming published Casino Royale, the first James Bond novel. In it, Bond orders a martini, not the traditional gin martini, but a vodka martini, shaken, not stirred. The phrase would become one of the most famous in popular culture. When the Bond films began in 1962 with Dr. No, vodka martinis became synonymous with cool, with danger, with sophisticated masculinity. This was the height of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in existential competition, nuclear weapons, space race, proxy wars across the globe. And yet Americans were enthusiastically drinking a Russian spirit. The irony was profound. Vodka became a kind of cultural conquest, a way of taming Russian menace, making it palatable, literally consuming the enemy. By the 1970s, vodka had surpassed whiskey as the best-selling spirit in the United States. It was in every bar, every liquor store, every middle-class home, and it bore almost no resemblance to the vodka that was destroying lives in the Soviet Union. American vodka was clean, marketed as pure, associated with luxury and aspiration. Advertisements featured beautiful people in elegant settings, penthouse parties, tropical beaches, cosmopolitan nightlife. There was no mention of addiction, of violence, of the centuries of suffering vodka had inflicted in its homeland. The 1980s and 90s saw the premium vodka explosion. Brands like Absolut, Stolichnaya, Grey Goose, Belvedere positioned themselves as luxury products, charging exorbitant prices for what was essentially neutral grain spirit filtered through charcoal. The marketing sold purity, craftsmanship, exclusivity. Vodka became status symbol, the drink of success. Grey Goose, launched in 1997, was particularly audacious. It was created by an American businessman specifically to be expensive, priced higher than any competitor, marketed as French luxury despite being designed for American tastes. It worked. Within years, Grey Goose was the top-selling premium vodka in America. The transformation was complete. Vodka had been divorced from its history, scrubbed clean of context, repackaged as aspiration. Americans sipping vodka cocktails in Manhattan bars had no idea, and largely didn't care, that the same substance was a tool of state oppression half a world away. Two worlds, one drink. In America, sophistication and glamour. In Russia, tragedy and death. The disconnect was absolute, and it persists to this day. But back in the Soviet Union, vodka was killing the empire from within. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was dying, not metaphorically, literally. The male population was experiencing a mortality crisis unprecedented in the developed world. Life expectancy for Soviet men, which had been rising steadily through the 1950s and 60s, had stalled. Then it began to fall. In 1964, Soviet male life expectancy was 66 years, respectable for the era, approaching Western levels. By 1980, it had dropped to 62 years. By 1984, it had fallen to 61. This was catastrophic. In peacetime, in an industrialized
nation with universal health care and full employment, life expectancy was going backward. The primary cause was vodka. Alcohol-related deaths, cirrhosis, heart disease,
accidents, violence, suicide were killing Soviet men in their 40s and 50s at extraordinary rates. Medical researchers documented the correlation with precision. Regions with the highest alcohol consumption had the lowest life expectancy. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, terrifying. The Soviet leadership could no longer ignore it. The empire was hemorrhaging human capital. The labor force was sick, unproductive, dying prematurely. The military was concerned about the physical fitness of conscripts. The demographic trajectory was unsustainable. Something had to be done. On March 11, 1985, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He was 54 years old, the youngest Soviet leader since Stalin. He inherited an empire in crisis, economic stagnation, technological backwardness, a costly war in Afghanistan, growing discontent among satellite states. And he inherited a population drowning in alcohol. Gorbachev had personal reasons to care. His father had been an alcoholic. He had witnessed firsthand the destruction that vodka inflicted on families, on communities, on the social fabric of Soviet life. And he believed, with the fervor of a true believer, that the Soviet Union could be saved through reform, glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Sobriety would be part of that salvation. In May 1985, just 2 months after taking power, Gorbachev launched the most aggressive alcohol campaign in Soviet history. The measures were sweeping and draconian. Vodka production was cut by half. Distilleries were closed or converted to other purposes. The state reduced the number of retail outlets selling alcohol. Prices were dramatically increased, in some cases doubled or tripled. Hours of sale were restricted. Alcohol could only be purchased after 2 p.m. and never on Sundays or state holidays. Public drunkenness became a criminal offense with serious penalties. Drunk drivers faced harsh punishment. Workplaces were required to enforce sobriety. Random breathalyzer tests, dismissal for alcohol-related infractions. The propaganda apparatus churned out alcohol campaign messaging, posters, films, newspaper articles, all condemning vodka as an enemy of Soviet progress. Most dramatically, Gorbachev ordered the destruction of vineyards. Across the southern republics, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, ancient vineyards were uprooted, bulldozed, burned. The goal was to eliminate domestic wine production, which Gorbachev saw as a gateway to harder alcohol. The cultural and agricultural loss was immense. The initial results were remarkable. Within the first year, alcohol consumption dropped by approximately 25%. Alcohol-related deaths fell by half between 1985 and 1987. Cirrhosis rates declined. Traffic accidents decreased. Workplace productivity increased. Life expectancy began to rise again, from 61 years in 1984 to 64 years by 1987. It was working. The Soviet Union was sobering up. But the economic consequences were catastrophic. Vodka revenue had accounted for somewhere between 15 and 20% of the Soviet state budget in the early 1980s. Conservative estimates put it at 100 billion rubles over the course of the decade. When Gorbachev slashed production and sales, that revenue evaporated. Over the 3 years of the campaign, the Soviet government lost more than 100 billion rubles in alcohol taxes and sales. The Soviet economy, already stagnating, could not absorb the shock. To compensate for the lost revenue, the government printed money. Inflation accelerated, the ruble weakened, budget deficits ballooned. The war in Afghanistan was draining resources. Oil prices, the Soviet Union's primary export, were declining. The economic reforms of perestroika were chaotic, creating instability without producing growth. And the black market exploded. Samagon production reached epidemic levels. Desperate for alcohol, Soviet citizens turned to home distillation on a scale not seen since World War I. The demand for sugar skyrocketed. It was the primary ingredient for moonshine. Within months, sugar disappeared from state stores. Rationing was introduced. People hoarded sugar like gold. Poisoning soared. Samagon was often toxic, contaminated with methanol, industrial solvents, anything that could produce intoxication. People drink cologne, aftershave, window cleaner, antifreeze, any liquid with alcohol content. Emergency rooms filled with victims of acute poisoning. Deaths from non-beverage alcohol consumption climbed into the tens of thousands.
The public fury was intense. Soviet citizens, already frustrated by economic shortages and political stagnation, saw the alcohol campaign as yet another example of the state's intrusion into private life. Gorbachev
Was mockingly called Lemonade Joe and Mineral Water Secretary. His popularity, initially high, began to erode. By 1987, the campaign was clearly unsustainable. The economic damage was too severe, the public backlash too strong, the black market too entrenched. In 1988, Gorbachev quietly began to reverse course. Restrictions were eased, vodka production increased, the anti-alcohol propaganda faded. The campaign was never officially ended. It simply dissolved, acknowledged as a failure without admission of fault. But the damage was done. Many historians argue that Gorbachev's anti-alcohol campaign accelerated the Soviet Union's economic collapse. The lost revenue, combined with the costs of Afghanistan, the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, falling oil prices, and the structural failures of the planned economy, created a perfect storm. By 1989, the Soviet economy was in crisis. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself would cease to exist. The irony is almost unbearable. Gorbachev's campaign had improved lives. People were healthier, living longer, more productive. But it had bankrupted the state. The Soviet government, like the Tsarist regime before it, had become so dependent on vodka revenue that sobriety was fatal. The state was an alcoholic, and when it tried to quit, it died. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. 15 independent republics emerged from the wreckage, and in the chaos that followed, vodka remained. The empires rose and fell. The ideologies came and went, but the bottle endured. When the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, vodka remained, and in the chaos that followed, it became both lifeline and executioner. The collapse unleashed catastrophe on a scale difficult to comprehend. 70 years of Soviet economic structure disintegrated overnight. State enterprises were privatized in chaotic auctions that resembled legalized theft. Savings evaporated as hyperinflation consumed the ruble. Pensions became worthless. Salaries went unpaid for months. The social safety net, flawed as it was, simply vanished. And the vodka market exploded into anarchy. The state monopoly dissolved. Anyone with a still, with access to industrial alcohol, with the willingness to take risks, could produce and sell vodka. The market flooded with product, some legitimate, much of it counterfeit, poisonous, lethal. It's estimated that by the mid-1990s, somewhere between 50 and 70% of vodka consumed in Russia was illegally produced or smuggled. Quality control disappeared. Methanol poisonings became epidemic. People died by the thousands from drinking what they thought was vodka, but was actually industrial solvent, antifreeze mixed with water, wood alcohol with flavor additives. Emergency rooms couldn't keep up. Morgues overflowed. The statistics were horrifying and likely undercounted. Legitimate vodka wasn't much better in terms of social impact. As the old state distilleries were privatized, they fell into the hands of a new class of businessmen who would become known as oligarchs. These men, and they were almost exclusively men, acquired state assets for pennies through rigged auctions, political connections, and outright corruption. Vodka distilleries were particularly valuable. Even in economic collapse, people would buy vodka. Fortunes were made overnight. The oligarchs became billionaires while the population descended into poverty. They exported premium vodka to the West for hard currency while selling cheap, low-quality spirits domestically. The irony was familiar. Russia's elites profiting from the people's suffering, a pattern centuries old. For ordinary Russians, vodka became the only escape from unbearable reality. Men who had been engineers, teachers, military officers found themselves unemployed, their skills worthless in the new economy. Women who had worked in state factories watched those factories close, their livelihoods disappeared. Entire communities built around Soviet industries, mining towns, manufacturing cities, collective farm regions, simply collapsed. The despair was universal. People drank to forget. They drank to endure. They drank because there was nothing else to do. The demographic statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1994, male life expectancy in Russia hit a low point of 57 years. 57. That's worse than many developing nations, worse than Russia had seen since World War II. This was peacetime in a nation with vast natural resources, universal literacy, nuclear weapons, and a space program, and men were dying in their 50s. The primary killers were cardiovascular disease, accidents, violence, and suicide.
all heavily correlated with alcohol abuse. Vodka was destroying the Russian population from within. Between 1991 and 2000, Russia experienced what demographers call excess deaths, mortality rates significantly above expected levels. The estimates vary, but somewhere between 5 and 6 million Russians died prematurely during this decade, not
From war, not from famine, from societal collapse, with vodka as both symptom and cause. The scenes from this era are almost too grim to recount. Veterans of the Afghanistan War, men who had survived combat, begging on street corners with bottles in hand. Brilliant scientists. Russia had world-class physicists, mathematicians, engineers, driving taxis or selling possessions to buy vodka. Entire villages in rural Russia where alcoholism was so pervasive that functional adults were a minority. Children suffered catastrophically. Orphanages filled with abandoned kids whose parents were dead, imprisoned, or too drunk to care for them. Fetal alcohol syndrome rates soared as pregnant women, themselves trapped in despair, continued drinking. A generation grew up in homes where violence and intoxication were daily realities. And at the top, presiding over this nightmare, was Boris Yeltsin, Russia's first democratically elected president, a man who embodied the contradiction and tragedy of the era. Yeltsin was a notorious alcoholic. His public drunkenness became international spectacle. In 1994, he was too drunk to get off a plane in Ireland, leaving the Irish Prime Minister waiting on the tarmac. In 1995, he gave slurred, incoherent speeches at public events. Foreign leaders dealt with a Russian president who was often visibly intoxicated. The symbolism was almost too perfect. Drunk Russia, led by a drunk president, lurching through a drunk decade. Yeltsin's government attempted some reforms. Taxes on alcohol were raised, regulations on production and labeling were introduced, but enforcement was non-existent. The state apparatus was too corrupt, too weak, too compromised to control anything. The black market operated openly. Organized crime controlled vast portions of the economy, including alcohol distribution. By the late 1990s, Russia was on the brink. The 1998 financial crisis wiped out what little economic stability had been achieved. The ruble collapsed again. Banks failed. The government defaulted on its debt. And through it all, vodka flowed. The one constant, the one reliable commodity in a nation where nothing else could be trusted. This was vodka's darkest chapter. Not as a tool of state control. There was barely a functional state. Not as a revenue source. The money was being stolen by oligarchs. But as a symptom of total societal collapse. When everything else failed, when hope disappeared, when the future became unthinkable, there was always vodka. The chaotic 90s would eventually end, but the scars remain. An entire generation lost to alcohol and despair. Millions of premature deaths. A demographic crater that Russia has never fully recovered from. Then came Putin, and with him a new chapter for vodka, and for Russia. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin became acting president on December 31, 1999, when Boris Yeltsin unexpectedly resigned. He was 47 years old, a former KGB officer, a man whose biography was deliberately opaque. Where Yeltsin had been chaotic, emotional, visibly drunk, Putin presented himself as the opposite, controlled, disciplined, calculatingly sober. The contrast was intentional. Putin's image was carefully constructed, the martial artist in a yogi-gi, the shirtless horseback rider, the stone-faced strategist. He drank certainly, Russian political culture demanded it, but never publicly to excess. He was the anti-Yeltsin, the leader who would restore order, dignity, strength. Sobriety was part of that restoration. And yet the state still needed vodka revenue. One of Putin's first moves was to reassert state control over the alcohol industry. The chaotic privatization of the 1990s had left vodka production in the hands of oligarchs and criminal networks. Putin moved to re-centralize, to regulate, to extract revenue more efficiently. New licensing requirements were introduced. Taxes on alcohol were systematically increased. Enforcement against counterfeit vodka became more aggressive. The crackdown had some success. By the mid-2000s, the percentage of illegal vodka in the market had declined from an estimated 50% to around 30%, still enormous but an improvement. Methanol poisonings decreased. The most egregiously toxic products were forced off the market, at least in major cities. But the state's dependence on alcohol revenue remained.
Combined with tobacco taxes, alcohol excise duties provided significant income to the federal and regional budgets. The exact percentages are difficult to determine. Russian budget transparency is limited, but conservative estimates suggest alcohol taxes contributed 5 to 10% of consolidated budget revenues throughout the 2000s and 2010s. The state was still fundamentally profiting from its citizens' addiction. Putin's government pursued a contradictory policy. On one hand, public health initiatives aimed at reducing consumption. In 2006, alcohol advertising was banned on television and radio. In 2010, regulations
prohibited the sale of alcohol after 11 p.m. In 2011, beer was reclassified from a food product to an alcoholic beverage, bringing it under stricter controls. Minimum prices were established, making cheap vodka more expensive. These measures had measurable effects. Alcohol consumption began to decline. Per capita consumption of pure alcohol dropped from a peak of around 15 liters in the early 2000s to approximately 12 liters by the mid-2010s. Still among the highest in the world, but trending downward. Male life expectancy, that grim indicator that had collapsed in the 1990s, began to recover. By 2010, it had risen to 63 years. By 2019, it reached 69 years, the highest in Russian history, finally surpassing the Soviet-era peak. Public health officials credited reduced alcohol consumption as the primary factor. Yet simultaneously, vodka was being promoted as a symbol of Russian identity and pride. State-sponsored brands like Russian Standard were positioned as premium exports, competing with Western vodkas on the global market. Vodka became part of Russia's soft power strategy, a cultural ambassador, proof of Russian sophistication and heritage. The toast culture remained mandatory. In business and politics and social gatherings, drinking was not optional. To refuse vodka was to insult your host, to signal weakness, to mark yourself as foreign. The rituals were ironclad. The first toast always to health. Subsequent toasts to friendship, to success, to Russia itself. 3 shots minimum was standard, more was expected. This created a strange duality. The state promoted moderation in public health campaigns, while the culture demanded excess. Putin himself embodied this contradiction, publicly temperate but presiding over a society where alcoholism remained endemic, where vodka defined masculinity, where sobriety was suspect. The demographic recovery, real as it was, masked ongoing problems. Rural Russia, the small towns and villages far from Moscow and St. Petersburg, continued to suffer catastrophic alcohol-related mortality. Male life expectancy in some regions remained below 60. Alcoholism treatment was underfunded, stigmatized, largely ineffective. Domestic violence, fueled by alcohol, remained epidemic. Then came 2022. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24th brought vodka back into international consciousness in an unexpected way through boycotts. Western bars and liquor stores removed Russian vodka from shelves. Brands like Stolichnya, despite being produced outside Russia, faced consumer rejection. Vodka became entangled with geopolitics, a symbol to be rejected or embraced based on political allegiance. The irony was that most Russian vodka sold in the West wasn't actually Russian. It was produced in Poland, France, the United States, marketed with Russian imagery and language. The boycotts were largely symbolic, but they highlighted how deeply vodka had become entwined with Russian national identity, how the drink and the nation had become inseparable in the global imagination. Inside Russia, vodka consumption spiked in the early months of the war. Anecdotal reports suggested Russians were drinking more, seeking escape from the stress, the uncertainty, the moral weight of the invasion. The states had nothing. The numbers were not published, but the pattern was familiar. Vodka as coping mechanism, as anesthetic, as the constant companion of Russian tragedy. Putin's era brought stability, economic growth, rising life expectancy, reduced alcohol mortality, but it did not break the fundamental relationship between the Russian state and vodka. The revenue still flowed, the addiction still persisted, the contradiction remained unresolved. Vodka was still Russia's curse, and Russia was still vodka's home. So after 5 centuries, what is vodka really? Strip away the marketing, the mythology, the centuries of propaganda both for and against. At its core, vodka is simple: ethanol and water. Green fermented, distilled, filtered. A chemical compound, C2H5OH, mixed with H2O. Neutral in flavor, clear in appearance, roughly 40% alcohol by volume. That's all it is, a liquid. It is not inherently evil, it cannot be. Molecules lack moral agency. Vodka doesn't corrupt, doesn't enslave, doesn't destroy. Humans do those things. Humans making choices about how to produce it, sell it, tax it, consume it. Humans building systems that weaponize addiction for profit. And yet, to call vodka neutral, to dismiss it as merely a chemical compound, feels obscene given the history we've traced. Tens of millions of lives cut short, families destroyed, communities hollowed out, empires funded and toppled, wars fought and lost, all of it connected inextricably to this liquid. The contradiction is the point.
Vodka is both things simultaneously, an inert substance and a historical force. The tragedy is not in the drink itself. The tragedy isn't what we chose to do with it. For
500 years, Russian rulers, tsars, empresses, commissars, presidents, understood a terrible truth. You could profit from your people's suffering. You could create the conditions that drove them to drink, then sell them the drink, then use the profits to maintain the system that created the suffering. It was efficient. It was monstrous. And it worked, generation after generation, century after century. Ivan the Terrible saw it first. Catherine the Great perfected it. Stalin rebuilt socialism on its foundation. Putin maintains it still. Different ideologies, different rhetoric, different aesthetics, but the same fundamental calculation. State revenue requires vodka sales. Vodka sales require addiction. Addiction requires despair. This is not unique to Russia. Every nation that has monetized vice through state monopolies has faced similar choices. Opium in China, alcohol in Sweden and Finland, lottery systems worldwide. The playbook is familiar. Create dependency, control supply, extract revenue. But nowhere else has this system operated for so long, so destructively, on such a scale as in Russia. The question that haunts this history is whether it had to be this way. Were there moments when different choices could have broken the cycle? When Tolstoy preached temperance, when the 1858 peasant riots demanded sobriety, when Lenin maintained prohibition, when Gorbachev tried to break free, in those moments, was another path possible? Perhaps, but the structural dependency was too deep. The state needed the money more than it needed healthy citizens. Short-term fiscal survival always triumphed over long-term human welfare. This is the logic of empires. This is the calculus of power. And today, the story remains unfinished. Russia's alcohol consumption has declined but remains among the world's highest. Life expectancy has improved but lags behind other developed nations. The toast culture persists. The state still profits. Young Russians drink less than their parents' generation, but the infrastructure of addiction, cultural, economic, political, remains intact. Meanwhile, in the West, vodka is luxury. It is cocktails at rooftop bars, premium brands in frosted bottles, James Bond sophistication. The disconnect between vodka's global image and its Russian reality has never been wider. We drink the same substance that destroyed millions of lives, and we think of elegance, of parties, of celebration. Perhaps that's mercy. Perhaps it's amnesia. Perhaps both. The plant doesn't judge, we said at the beginning of another story. But vodka isn't a plant. It's a human creation. We made it. We chose what to do with it. We built the systems that turned water of life into water of death. And we carry that history, whether we acknowledge it or not. The bottle remains. Clear liquid in glass. The chemistry is unchanged. But the weight is there. 5 centuries of choices. Of suffering. Of rulers choosing revenue over human life. Of people seeking escape from unbearable conditions. Of contradictions never resolved. Can nations break addictions? Can systems built on exploitation be reformed? Or must they collapse? Can we learn from this history? Or are we doomed to repeat it with different substances, different victims, different justifications? These are not rhetorical questions. They demand answers. But the answers are not here. Not in this history. Not in this bottle. The vodka remains. Indifferent. Waiting. The choices are ours. They always were.